The very next day, he came to my hotel in Port of Spain, and he laid out this huge map on the counter in the lobby of the hotel. And he showed me exactly where this sleeper cell was located. I was surprised, first of all, that it was located so close to Piarco International Airport, which is the largest airport in Trinidad. And he explained to me that this area was a swampland before this group took it over, a Muslim group that was funded largely by Saudi Arabia. And they converted it into a livable space with a mosque, and I believe it was a number of houses I saw in the area, a school, as well as a grocery store that was a kind of communal grocery store. So he drove me to the area, and what I saw really was an innocuous gated community, essentially, of Muslims, sort of a commune. There was a sentry at the front of the road leading into the commune, and in the sentry box was a guard. Many places in Trinidad have these sentry boxes and guards to protect them because of the high rates of crime in the country. In fact, my neighborhood where I lived was a very nice neighborhood, but I've benefited from having a high-level oil executive living next door to me who had a sentry and a guard. So we felt kind of protected because of him at all times. Anyway, so once I got there, the sentry asked us a few questions. I realized that he probably knew Professor Samaru, who had devoted some of his time to help the kids in that commune prepare for common entrance examinations. If you know anything about the Caribbean, you know that it's very British. They have things like GCEs and O levels and A levels, and students have to prepare themselves for these common entrance examinations. But when you're living in an isolated community like that one, and you're not connected to the main school system, sometimes you have to hire independent people, private tutors, more or less, to prepare students for the common entrance examination. So he had done some work with that group, and they knew him quite well. The place was very peaceful. I mean, like I said, it had a mosque, it had a school, grocery store, homes, which housed what looked to me like normal Muslim families. The women in the commune were wearing mostly alamira hijab. Some wore the niqab. The men wore these long white thobes. And it made me feel as though I was back into Saudi Arabia or Qatar or United Arab Emirates or Dubai. When I found out that this was an Al-Qaeda sleeper cell operating under the noses of the Trinidadian government, funded largely by Salafists from Saudi Arabia. Anyone who knows about Salafism would know that this is an ultra-conservative reform branch of Islam, of Sunni Islam, and it's been operating in Arabia since the 18th century. So Salafists can be found literally in several countries in the region, but most of them are found in the hub of Saudi Arabia. And Salafists advocate a literal, puritanical, and very strict form of Islam, and Islam that is pure and unadulterated as far as they're concerned. And this can be traced back to the founders of Salafism, the early followers of the Prophet Muhammad. It's important to mention this because those folks I saw in the sleeper cell were quite different from most of the Muslims I'd met in Trinidad and Tobago. You have to bear in mind that, for lack of a better term, these were fundamentalist Muslims, and quite different from the majority of Muslims in the country who appeared to be quite moderate in their position, quite moderate in terms of their views and actions. And most of the local Trinidadian Muslims, more or less blend in quite easily into the culture of Trinidad. You know, you saw in the video there, the dancing and the cavorting and so on. I mean, that happens even within the Muslim community, believe it or not. Many of them are quite connected to the culture of Trinidad and Tobago, while maintaining their commitment to their faith. So fast forward 7 years later, I was offered the position of Director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. My university, University of Alberta, graciously allowed me to go there more or less on loan to the University of the West Indies to help set up a school of diplomacy, talking about diplomacy, to serve the entire Caribbean. Believe it or not, while there was the Institute of International Relations, which I ended up being the director of, diplomacy, which was supposed to be at the center of that institute, had given way to a much more academically focused program, degrees, master's level degrees, PhD degrees, and so on. And they've forgotten the essentials of what was important for that particular institute, which was to develop diplomats in the region. So I took upon myself, during the time that I was there, to create a diplomatic school. It's called now the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean. Managed to get money from the Trinidadian government to build a building, so we now have a new building for the Diplomatic Academy. And was able to bring in people from outside of the region to train Trinidadians in their own setting, rather than have Trinidadians go abroad, or Caribbean people, because most of them came not just from Trinidad, but also from the rest of the Caribbean, to be trained in Trinidad. Before that school was created, if you wanted to learn about diplomacy, you had to go elsewhere. So that, for example, the Australian government had a program where they sort of brought in Caribbean folks to Australia to be trained as diplomats. The Swiss, who, by the way, gave the money to create that Institute of International Relations some 50 years ago. The Swiss were always involved in also training Caribbean people in diplomacy in Switzerland. But there was no indigenous training facility for Caribbean folks to learn diplomacy. So I think this is one of our legacies and our contributions. You have to thank the University of Alberta for this, because they allowed me the opportunity to go down there to set this up. But the reason I mention that is that it was during my secondment there in Trinidad that I took it upon myself to sort of pursue the research into the recruitment of Trinidadians as jihadist fighters. And I worked with one of my colleagues, another one of my students, John McCoy, and we began to explore the reasons why this fun-loving, culturally and religiously diverse country, Trinidad and Tobago, could become the target for ISIS recruitment. On the surface, one would wonder, why would this country be the prime target for jihadi extremism? You saw the pictures of the fun-loving carnival sites. You know, it's a highly diverse, friendly, fun-loving country. It is well known around the world for its carnival. Some of the top carnivals in the world is comparable to the kind of carnivals you have there in Trinidad. So, for example, the Rio Carnival and the Mardi Gras in New Orleans. We have in Toronto, the big Toronto Carnival, and even in Edmonton we have a carnival in Edmonton. And if you look at that carnival, most of the people who organize this are from Trinidad. That's the model that they use. So the impression one gets as a visitor to the Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is that the people of Trinidad and Tobago are carefree, happy-go-lucky. In fact, their favorite mantra, as I found out when I was there, was, God is a Trini. Trini is a shortened form of Trinidadian. So God is a Trini. And this is actually a very important mantra for them, because The Caribbean region has long had a history of devastating natural disasters, as you know. You've heard about the hurricanes in Haiti and Jamaica, and the earthquakes and the volcanoes and the flooding and the mudslides and the droughts. Yet Trinidad and Tobago, for some reason, has been able to escape much of the devastation of major hurricanes, volcanoes, mudslides, floods, droughts, etc. It has a rich agricultural soil, an overabundance of tropical fruits and vegetables. I never lacked for mangoes, for example, because right in my yard there was always mangoes that grew throughout the entire year. There was no season, they grew throughout the entire year. And in fact, my gardener, for some reason, would come into this team and steal my mangoes, because they felt that if they were working on the property, that was also their mangoes too. So it's flushed with oil and gas, this country of Trinidad and Tobago, both on land and also offshore oil. As a result, Trinidad and Tobago is considered to be the wealthiest country in the Caribbean and a great place for foreign direct investment. But there is also another side of Trinidad and Tobago, and that is a much darker side, a much seedier side. It has the highest murder rate per capita of any Caribbean country. For a population of 1.3 million, Trinidad and Tobago had, in 2016, 478 murders. You have to compare that population to the population of Edmonton, I guess, right? It's about 1.3 million, right? I don't know how many murders we had in 2016, but I'm sure it's not close to 478 murders. In 2017 so far, there have been 303 murders. And it's not just a spike in murders that's troubling. It is the manner in which many of these individuals who are murdered are murdered, and that makes it even more troubling. So while I was there between 2013 and 2016, but in 2013, I remember, there were a number of cases of severed heads found in dumpsters, with the rest of the bodies found in the trunk of cars, abandoned cars. One morning in particular, in September 2013, I woke up to the news that a human head was found on the sidewalk of one of the busiest streets in the downtown Port of Spain, and the street called Nelson Street. A man's headless body was found a few feet away in an abandoned lot. And I was told that this was a typical gangland killing. It was gruesome enough to send a particular message to members of an opposing gang. And this is in Trinidad, the fun-loving, touristy country. Little kids on their way to school walked by that head because it was kept there for like almost 3 to 4 hours on the sidewalk. You can imagine how traumatic that was for some of those kids that walked by the head of that man. In February of 2014, the severed head of an ex-prisoner was found on a table of a bar in San Fernando, which is on the southern part of Trinidad. The man's body was then found in a sugar cane field in a place called Debe, which is quite a few miles away from San Fernando. The gruesomeness of these murders caused one journalist, a friend of mine there in Trinidad, to write recently that it seems like the devil is vacationing on the Twin Isle Republic. And it has become evident that it really doesn't matter which government is in power. Because when the opposition forces, which are now the government, when they were in opposition, at the very beginning of my time there in Trinidad, They criticized the then government of not being able to tackle the problems of crime and murder in Trinidad. Now they are in power, and they've had even higher rates of murder in the country. So crime has not stopped, even with the new government. So Trinidad and Tobago has in fact become a magnet for transnational criminal activity. It has a major it's become a major transshipment point for drug trafficking, for gun running, for human trafficking. And it helps to facilitate the transit of over $17 billion worth of cocaine to the United States. Coupled with the drug trade is the influx of guns into the country. Trinidad does not manufacture guns, but there are more guns per capita in Trinidad and Tobago than any other part of the Caribbean. So obviously they're coming from somewhere else. And these guns have helped to elevate the numbers of murders in the country and elevate the extent of the criminal activity across the country. The porousness of Trinidad and Tobago's borders, they're not very well policed, not very well sort of monitored, combined with the corruption of border officials, combined with the corruption of business executives and politicians, I think makes Trinidad and Tobago very vulnerable to the territorial penetration by transnational criminal elements, and also by terrorist organizations. So why is there jihadism, extremism, if you will, in Trinidad and Tobago? Well, among Caribbean countries, Trinidad and Tobago has a unique history of radicalization. There was a guy called Stuart Lee Carmichael. I don't know if you ever heard the name Miriam Makeba, the great singer from Africa, right? She was married to Stuart Lee Carmichael, who was a Trinidadian, a great Black Power advocate, a prominent figure in the Black civil rights movement in the United States, and a proponent of a very radical form of Pan-Africanism. And he was a Trinidadian. He had quite a following in Trinidad. One of his followers was the guy you saw on the screen just now, Yasser Abu Bakr, who is a very tall, very handsome, very tall guy. And he was very charismatic, educated, believe it or not, in Canada, in Toronto. This is where he became a Muslim. He was converted to the Muslim faith in Toronto. Went back to Trinidad and created this Jamaat al-Muslimin group in Trinidad. This was a group that held the Prime Minister hostage in the Parliament buildings there in 1990 when they staged a major coup, attempted coup of the country. They took over the television stations, radio stations in Port of Spain. And remarkably, even though Abu Bakr and his radical gang were forced to surrender, they managed to work out an amnesty deal with the government at the time that allowed them to avoid any prison time. So these guys who would normally, in any other country, would be tried for treason and probably hung, are now walking in the streets of Trinidad and Tobago. They have been working with successive governments, getting funding from those governments in order to placate the people who feel marginalized within that society, particularly those in the Black Muslim community. I say Black Muslim community because there is a difference between the Black Muslims and the Indo-Muslims, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there are remnants of radicalism and extremism in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. Not all those remnants are Muslims, by the way. Indeed, there's a long-standing Muslim community in that country. The first mosque, I believe, was built in 1868 in the southern part of Trinidad. And while that community constitutes only about 5 to 6% of the population of Trinidad and Tobago, it's been traditionally a very significantly active, peaceful, and proud community. Muslims have a very powerful voice within the politics of Trinidad and Tobago in that diverse population of the Twin Island state. Some of them are African Muslims who came there during slavery. Some of them are descendants, obviously, of slaves. Others are Indian Muslims, Indo-Muslims that came as indentured servants close to when the time that slavery was being abolished. They needed to have workers play a role in the agricultural sector of the country and the region, and they brought in Indians from India to be indentured servants in that country. More recently, Trinidad and Tobago has attracted Muslims from the Middle East, and there is a small but growing number of new converts to Islam, many of whom came out of Christianity and are now part of the new Muslim population there. Most of these folks are not grounded, they're not steeped in the fundamental teachings of Islam. Let's face it, many of them don't know very much about the Hadith and the Quran, the Sunnah. They're not grounded in the fundamental teachings of Islam, and as a result, they're easily manipulated by radical Islamic teachers. Okay, that's what's been going on. So converting to Islam or being a long-standing Muslim in that country is not a recipe necessarily for the embrace of extremism. Indeed, as you know, most Muslims in Trinidad and Tobago are peaceful, successful citizens who just happen to be practicing their faith and wanting to do good within their communities or any other group within the country. Extremism has nothing to do with the Muslim faith. I can say that for sure, because I've met enough of those Muslims to know that the majority of them are peaceful and family-devoted individuals, good citizens. What has happened recently, though, is that with the 130 Trinidadians being now sent or taken off from Trinidad to go to fight in as foreign fighters for extremist groups like ISIS, most of them found their way to Syria and Iraq and joined forces of extremism because they were fooled into believing that this was an important part of the religion, right? Jihad and fighting on behalf of the faith was extremely important. It would appear that the majority of these Trinidadian jihadis are recent converts, the ones that have gone over are recent converts to Islam. Some have been drawn to ISIS on the promise of financial gain. Some are from lower economic strata of the society in Trinidad. Some have felt marginalized, and they see joining ISIS as their way out of poverty and their way out of marginalization, to be part of a larger community that really wants them. They've been able to convince, the ISIS folks have been able to convince these vulnerable young people, young converts to the religion, that the way of life in Trinidad and Tobago is shallow, sinful, full of debauchery, and hopeless. And they offer their vision of Islam as a way out for these individuals who essentially feel marginalized in their society, who are looking for a new way of life that would give them purpose and meaning. So ISIS has utilized a series of very slick propaganda videos, very slick internet sites and magazines, like The Big, for example, to promote the idea of religious piety and responsibility as a mandatory part of being a Muslim. They have pushed the notion of the caliphate that can offer freedom from the bonds of neocolonialism, from the dreaded police force that usually attack them in their country, and to allow them, they also allow freedom to carry guns, weapons to protect the community of believers from the unbelievers. So for them, they have been indoctrinated. I think the people in Trinidad today who have gone over there have been indoctrinated into fighting on behalf of this notion of jihad that's prescribed to all Muslims. Some of these brainwashed new converts have taken their young children to Syria. I have another video which I can't show today, but show you how these young kids are feeling part of a community there in Syria, going to school and learning the religious teachings and doctrines there, something that they feel that they weren't able to do in Trinidad and Tobago for some reason. Now, the biggest misconception, I'm going to close here now, is the biggest misconception I think that most people have about terrorism and extremism is that it is kind of limited to people from Muslim countries. This has been a real misconception, I think, in many parts of the West. This is not an Islamic problem. This is not true, because terrorism is found in many countries, in many regions of the world. It is not limited to predominantly Muslims and Muslim countries. You can find terrorism found in places where people actually practice the Christian faith, practice the Buddhist faith, practice Hinduism. So it's not limited to the Muslim religion. I skip over a couple of things here, but I just want to say that we now have in our own country and in our province a whole breed of homegrown terrorists and extremists who are not Islamic. We have witnessed the terrorist actions of Ander Breivik, for example, in Norway, the terrorism of the NRA in Northern Ireland, the terrorism of separatist movements in France and Spain, in Canada, in Albania, in Sri Lanka, none of whom had anything to do with Islam. We have neo-Nazis like Michael Page or Dylan Roof, for example, or white supremacists like James Field, who recently plowed his car into anti-racist protesters in Virginia, killing Heather Heyer. And all of these are extremists who have nothing whatsoever to do with Islam or the Muslim community. So I think that's important to say. And we have our own homegrown terrorists here in Canada and would-be terrorists right here in the province of Alberta. While I was doing the paper, I came across an article that mentioned Renee and her work with the anti-hate groups. And we've seen them in Churchill Square spewing their ideologies of Islamophobia, racism, and hate. Most of them are far-right nativists and white supremacists, no different from the ones we saw in Virginia recently at the hate rally and the terrorist incident in Charlottesville. It is estimated that there are somewhere between 12 to 15 hate groups in our province alone. And most of these people are targeting Muslims, Jews, and non-Anglo-Saxon immigrants in this country. These are xenophobic, xenoracist groups from the Aryan nation, the Aryan Guard, Blood and Honor, the Freemen on the Land, Soldiers of Odin, the 3%, you name it. There are a whole bunch of them here in this province. And they have to be monitored and they have to be confronted. We cannot allow these ideologies of hate to permeate our society. But apart from shedding light and spotlight on them, we ought to do what I think the John Humphrey Center has been doing for quite some time. We ought to spend more time teaching our kids, teaching our young people the fundamentals of human rights. We have to remember that people are not born with hatred and malice in their hearts. These things are learned. And if they are learned, they can be unlearned. Let's make a pledge to move towards unity in diversity, to love our neighbors. Most religions have that mantra, but love our neighbors as we love ourselves, to learn more about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what every single clause in that declaration really means, to teach the younger generation what their rights are, so that as human beings, so that they're not mistaken about what their rights are in our multicultural society. At the same time, let's work towards developing a culture of peace through a strategy that counters violent extremism. And it's that countering violence extremism strategy, which we have tried to develop here in Edmonton now, that the United Nations is starting to take a look at very seriously, because what we're pushing is this notion of addressing the underlying reasons why people, especially young people, are being drawn to violent extremist ways of dealing with their problems. In my opinion, the best way to counter violent extremism is to tackle the root causes of societal violence, to get away from blaming a particular religion or a particular culture for everything that ails us, to try to understand why individuals are feeling marginalized from society, from community, from family. Why do they feel that violence has to be the only means to an end? Where is this hate coming from? Where is the anger originating? What can we do to mitigate this problem? How can we help young people to hope, to have hope, to be good citizens, to choose love over hate? I think that, my friends, is the only way, I think, out of this dark tunnel of hate, xenophobia, and racism. Unity and diversity is a light at the end of the dark tunnel, not only for Trinidadians and Tobagans, or Trinidadians, as they try to call themselves, but also for us right here in the province of Alberta. Peace.
Thank you very much, Andy. Okay, we don't have much time, so I think what we should do is just maybe entertain a couple questions from the audience if there's interest. Ranya's ready to go, so just go up to the mic, Rania, and Shariar, maybe you can be as well, and then, yeah, and shoot away. Let me grab this mic.
Well, thank you both so much. I was hoping that I could get both of your insights on the role of technology in contemporary armed conflict. And as you know, it's really outdated for state actors to be declaring war nowadays. And the fact of the matter is that it's not only state actors involved in non-international and international armed conflict. And at the same time, like you were saying, Stephanie, there's so much, trillions of dollars being spent on, oh my gosh, on conflict. There's no political pressure to lessen this. And at the same time, I feel as if our legal and moral systems are completely unprepared to tackle this. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on technology and what we can do here to let people know about this.
Thank you for your question. I think that we're really at the cusp of an interesting shift here when it comes to engagement by citizens on foreign policy, because foreign policy used to be the domain of the privileged, the foreign policy executive. And in a sense, it was very difficult to penetrate that space. Recently, we've seen greater calls for the democratization of foreign policy, and that pressure is only going to come from the people, from youth, to demand more transparency, to demand more information, to demand more data. And the government has been somewhat responsive to that in the disclosure of what they spend on what. And of course, in preparation for this talk, I went and looked up all of the numbers, and it's fairly readily available. So I think I've seen quite a bit of transformation from the time I was an undergraduate student to now, being a prof at Queen's and seeing, foreign policy in that realm becoming increasingly accessible. And with that data and with that knowledge, then you feel very much empowered to ask questions, to be very critical about some of the policy choices that we're making. So that's very encouraging to me on those days where I turn on the news and I feel a bit discouraged, and sometimes it feels like I'm waking up from the same nightmare every morning. Looking at some of the discouraging events that are happening, that gives me cause for hope. The fact that if citizens can be empowered with that readily available information, then they're going to be better at asking the right questions and holding governments to account. And that's so that's technology making information more accessible and pushing and enabling people to ask for greater transparency. On the other end of your question is, defense and all of that money, and how we're investing so much in this kind of military machine. And I have to say, the military are highly trained, they're ready to go. So it's very tempting, I think, for people and governments that when a conflict flares up, the instinct is, okay, we can send the military in there and maybe stabilize the situation. And it's true, the military serves its purpose that way in creating humanitarian space for then the other actors to come in and build peace. But sometimes we expect the military to do too much, to go beyond that securing of the humanitarian space. And I think that's what we really need to be careful about.
Is that okay?
Just click. Oh.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for such a great presentation from Dr. Andy and Stephanie. Just a little comment and then my question. It was in 1976 when Soviet Union entered their forces into Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda was created and brought from the Middle East and planted into Afghanistan. Just want to clarify that. And then fundamentalists were recruited from around the world, and the weapons came from Israel and the money came from a big country, and then the thing started and it's now impacting everyone's life. So just a comment on that. My question to Stephanie is that in the presence of NATO, can we think of independent foreign policy for Canada? And how we can improve our relationship with Russia, knowing that it's a very big country and has a heavy military. And my question to Andy is that you describe the whole history and the present situation. What role international politics or geopolitical strategy played in all these things that you have described? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Start with NATO's role. So NATO right now has missions all over the world, from countering piracy to what's called enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states. So there are 4 battle groups in Poland and the 3 Baltic countries, and Canada is leading one of those battle groups in Latvia. So in terms of improving relations with Russia, I feel like that presence is going to be problematic for the political relationship between the 2 countries. Already we've seen that the Canadian Armed Forces are the target of propaganda attacks by Russian actors. So the very presence of the Canadian Armed Forces in Latvia is being, I guess, trolled on social media sites, but also on certain Russian-speaking sites to communicate to Latvians that the Canadian Armed Forces have no business there, for instance, and try to undermine that support. So I think that Canada, being one of the framework nations or leading nations, one of the 4 countries leading battle groups in that space, will make it more difficult for its political relationship with Russia. When it comes to independence of foreign policy, in a sense, Canada having that leadership role gives it a lot of latitude, because you have 4 of these states leading battle groups, And so essentially, they're in charge of the planning and the direction of activities on the ground. And so that always comes back to Ottawa, even though NATO as an alliance is based in Brussels, as in a collection of 29 states, and they make consensus-based decision-making. Anything that Canada does is always called back to Ottawa, and Ottawa has the final say in what Canada does, which is a great thing about how NATO works, because it does respect the sovereignty of individual member states. Now, that's not to say that bigger countries don't sometimes pressure smaller countries in the decision-making process. But in this case, I think that Canada has set itself up for greater independence and decision-making power in the NATO context by stepping up to lead that battle group in Latvia.
Thanks very much for your question. This whole question of geopolitics is a huge question. But I'd have to say, let's begin with looking at what's happening currently in current events history, and also look back at what's happened in what I call longue durée history, and we get a sense of what's really happening. I think right now we are at the advent of what I would call a new world disorder. I use that term advisedly because, back in 1945, when we created a new world order, essentially, after the end of the Second World War, it was an order that was more or less led by Britain and the United States. They provided leadership for the creation of this new world order, which included the creation of the United Nations, creation of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Trade Organization, etc. All of these institutions are now being under attack by a number of forces, including President Trump. So I see this particular moment in history as the beginnings of what I would call a new world disorder, in which many of the things that we took for granted about the past world order are being attacked. And this disintegration of the old world order, or the existing world order, let's put it that way, brings about the kind of turbulence that we're seeing in society in general. And I think the growth of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram are just basically examples of this disintegration that's happening across the entire globe, which is just simply another symptom of the decline in the old world order. You have to bear in mind that there have been in the past this transition from old orders to new orders, and it's always been accompanied by disintegration, by disorganization, by chaos in some cases before the new order comes into being. So I believe that we are at that particular moment right now in history, and this probably explains a lot about what's happening. The divisions and the hate and so on that we see is just simply symptomatic of that ending of one world order and the creation probably of a new one. What it's going to look like, we don't really know, but certainly I think that we are on the cusp of this new, moving towards a new world order. And we are in the midst of this tension and trauma and disintegration, because that's the critical moment that we are at right now.
That's a lot to take in. Thinking about that.
Sorry, not
the disorder, right? And I think the overwhelmingness of what's happening in our world right now, and trying to reconcile what that could look like and what that would look like, and whether order is even in the order. Thank you both for, I think you guys have presented some really different thoughts for us this afternoon from what we've been talking about, and that, like, we've been talking yesterday, we were focused on hate and talking about what that looks like here, and as we start to project outwards, and especially when we start to think about our roles and responsibilities as Canada in our foreign policy, I think it's an issue that is challenging to reconcile when we think about all this stuff that's happening inside and how unhealthy, I mean, maybe I'm being too overbroad, but the unhealthiness of what's within Canada right now and trying to reconcile our role internationally is really interesting. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to be with us today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else does too, so give these guys a hand. You want to hang there for a minute? So before we break off for the last workshops of the day, just a couple announcements and just reminders. Reminder, afterwards, please do come back and let's engage in conversation. And there's button making and zines that are going to be being built. And I don't know if you've seen the bus yet, but it's the last chance for you to see the bus out there. And then we just have two announcements in particularly in relation to workshops this afternoon, is that the Growing Marijuana in Alberta workshop, unfortunately, Allison, her mom's in a really bad state in the hospital, so she's asked to not come today. And then the reconciliation in schools, both of those are canceled. However, we do have Yusin here who's going to actually do a workshop as well. There's a gentleman up with me on stage this morning when we were showing the video. And he's going to do a workshop on racism and the discussion of Black communities in British Columbia. So based on our conversations yesterday about the Black community in Alberta and what evolved there, he's going to take that conversation a little bit further. So he is going to be in room 9215, which is on the second floor here. So we can break off for workshops, and do feel free to come back and let's have a conversation. I think the biggest thing I want to say is, at the end of the day, is our time to really talk about how can we work together? How do we need to be engaging with each other? We all come from very different perspectives and backgrounds. We've got media, we've got city, we've got grassroots, we've got a number of different perspectives here, and for us, we can be in this space just to learn and to network, but I think if we can figure out where our intersections are, that's the opportunity at the end of the day. So I really encourage and welcome you back.